Michael for being with us. So
Good afternoon.
good afternoon. First of all, I would like to know a little bit about what's your take on what's going on right now in Europe.
Well, the crisis that we've got in Europe, particularly around sovereign debt, I think is something that's causing great concern. I mean, we are worried how far the contagion is going to spread. I mean, we've seen a bailout for Greece and Ireland. We're now considering whether or not Portugal and perhaps Spain and Italy are going to be brought into this particular downward spiral. It is a major issue in terms of confidence in the European market going forward. So we do need to actually stem this contagion. But the question is, where will the break be? Will the break be at Portugal, or is it going to be at one of the larger economies? Because when you start talking about bailouts potentially for Spain and Italy, I mean, you're talking then about two very serious economies in terms of size, and the cost of bailing either of those two out would be very considerable by comparison to what we've seen already. I think the other thing that I would add in terms of the outlook for the European market is that at the moment we have a real powerhouse in Europe, which is Germany. And Germany is driving forward the Eurozone at an enormous pace. But Germany's success is actually masking how sluggish some of the other Eurozone economies are at the moment. And I think the worry going forward into 2011 and 2012 is that perhaps the German recovery won't be sustainable at its current levels, and if that's the case and Germany comes off the pace, the whole Eurozone will look very sluggish indeed. From the UK perspective, I mean, we have just had two very strong quarters in terms of economic growth, but in 2011 we're going to see the impact of the fiscal cuts that have been announced by the coalition government, and we're also expecting a slowing in the UK economy. So I think the prognosis for Europe going forward is don't expect sparkling growth figures in 2011 and 2012.
And also, after all this financial crisis, all this economic recession, which lessons can we learn from it? And do you see all the world governments coordinated going towards the future to establish this recovery?
Well, that's actually the reason why we're in New York today, because we've been holding a policy roundtable to look at the crisis we've just been through and to understand whether or not there are any meaningful legacies that we're going to see in 5, 10 or 15 years' time from this crisis. And what we see from government is that when the crisis was at its height in 2008, governments were willing to interact, and they worked together in the eye of the storm and had a number of very successful summits that actually prevented the crisis spiralling down into something worse than just a recession, and we avoided a slump, and that's very positive. What we see there today, and we've just seen it with the Seoul summit back in November, is that the governments don't seem to have that same urgency. They're retreating back to their national boundaries and not cooperating with each other to the same degree. Now, where are they not cooperating with each other? I mean, it's around areas like regulation, because if regulation is national based, that isn't dealing with the reality of the world today, which sees many of the major corporates actually trading across global national boundaries and by region, and that's an issue. There are other things that the governments haven't been willing to do in terms of ceding regulatory powers to supranational authorities. And then closer to home in terms of the accountancy profession, I mean, we'd very much like to see a global set of accounting standards, which means that you can compare results of companies across boundaries. And of course, although we've made tremendous progress in IFRS in recent years, the biggest market of them all, the US, is still out, and we're waiting until 2011 for a decision as to whether or not that's going to be go or no go.
So would you say that the financial regulators right now towards all these accountability issues are doing enough or not, or there's still a lot of things to do?
I think there is still a great deal to do. I mean, in terms of the major pieces of regulation and policy that have been proposed, both in Europe and the US. I think it's very early days to see whether or not any of that is going to create any lasting changes. I mean, here in the US, the Dodd-Frank Act is an enormous piece of legislation, but whether or not when you actually enact it, it is going to make the difference that the politicians hoped it was going to make is another matter. And in Europe, well, Europe is still looking at what its response is going to be in a whole variety of areas. And although it has put some regulation in, certainly for banking supervision, across the 27 states, I mean, we don't yet know the impact of that. So I mean, it's very early days. I mean, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that this is a crisis that had massive regulatory failure. I mean, the failure was on the part of the regulators. They were asleep at the wheel. So I mean, it behoves them to get their act together to make sure that if we do have a legacy from this crisis, it's better regulation.
Okay, and just a last question, also related with regulation, but now talking about businesses, what are the challenges of corporate governance looking ahead?
Well, in terms of corporate governance, we saw in this crisis that no matter where you were in the world, there were probably some questions that the corporate governance systems that were being employed needed to address going forward. If we look at it from a European perspective, and of course corporate governance is not as one across Europe, it's not uniform. There are a number of, I think, questions that need to be asked around the executive, and first of all, questions about executive remuneration. I mean, do you actually reward people on performance, or are we just paying more because no company wants their executives to be rewarded outside the top quartile? And as soon as you get into this pay policy of people will be rewarded in the top quartile, it just drives the whole things up. Should the role of the chairman and CEO be split? I mean, what do we expect from boards going forward? Because again, one of the challenges from this crisis is that as companies have grown, and we've got incredibly complex financial institutions in particular, but also some incredibly complex multinationals, do the boards actually understand the risks that the companies are running? Do they understand how the money is being made? Because I think one of the findings of this crisis is they possibly don't. And I think probably the final thing in the corporate governance sphere is that we need to make sure that investors, the owners of these businesses, play an active role. They cannot abrogate that responsibility to somebody else. They're the people who own these companies, and of course investors are often playing that role on behalf of us, the wider public. They have to be active. If they don't like something that's going on, they have to get in there and say it and change behaviour. And
do you see a lot of differences between corporate governance here in the US towards corporate governance back in Europe?
Well, I think there are some very distinct differences. I mean, even though we have many common roots and we can probably trace our histories back to common starting points. The focus is different. I mean, one of those points I just mentioned, which I think is a key issue, splitting the role of the chairman and the chief executive, is something that is still not that common in the US, but in Europe and particularly in the UK, that's actually prohibited by the governance code. If you put so much power in the hands of one individual, it becomes very difficult for a board and indeed investors to challenge and change the course of direction if they don't like the strategy that individual is pursuing for the company.
Thank you, Michael, for your time. Really interesting issues you talk about.
Thank you very much.